The morning on Byul 3 started the way every morning started. Quiet, warm, safe. The sun came up over the hills and turned the sky orange and pink, and the farming domes caught the light like bubbles sitting on the grass. It was a small colony. Only 2,000 people lived there, and most of them were farmers or scientists or teachers. It was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where doors were left open, and children ran barefoot between the garden rows. Yuna stood by the window of her small house and watched her 2 children walk toward the school dome. Soy was 8 years old, and she held her little brother's hand the way she always did, with a grip that was too tight and too careful at the same time. Jaeho was 5. He was carrying a drawing he had made that morning. It was a picture of their family standing under a big tree, and the tree had stars growing on it instead of fruit. He wanted to show his teacher. She was a scientist. She studied soil and plants, and how to make things grow on worlds that were far from Earth. It was quiet work, good work. She liked it here. Byul 3 was not an important place. It had no military base. It had no weapons. It had a treaty with the Galactic Assembly that said it was protected, and that was supposed to be enough. It was not enough. The first sign that something was wrong was the sound. It came from the sky, a deep, low hum that made the glass in the windows shake. Yuna looked up and saw shadows falling across the sun. Ships, dozens of them. They were long and dark and covered in sharp angles, like insects made of metal. They dropped out of the sky so fast that by the time the colony's little alarm system started screaming, the first bombs had already hit the ground. The eastern farming dome exploded, then the water tower, then the communications building. The blasts came one after another, so close together that they sounded like one long roll of thunder that would not stop. Yuna was thrown to the floor. Glass fell around her. Dust filled the air. She could not hear anything except ringing, and then, underneath the ringing, she could hear screaming. She ran. She ran toward the school dome because that was where her children were, and nothing in the universe mattered except getting to them. But the streets were full of smoke and fire and falling pieces of metal, and there were shapes moving through the smoke. Tall shapes, thin shapes. They moved on too many legs, and their eyes were black and wet like oil. The Verath had come. Nobody on Byul 3 knew much about the Verath Dominion. They were an insectoid species that controlled about 40 star systems on the far side of the sector. They were known for being aggressive and proud, and for looking down on species they considered soft. But they had never attacked a human colony before. There was no reason for it, no warning, no demand. They simply came, and they came for one thing: the children. Minho was 23 years old, and he was a sergeant in the colony's tiny security team. There were only 12 of them. They had sidearms and light armor, and they were trained to handle bar fights and lost hikers, not a full-scale military invasion. But when the Verath ships landed and the soldiers poured out, Minho did not run. He grabbed his weapon. He called his team on the radio, and he said the only thing he could think of: "Get to the school, now." They fought. It was not a fair fight. It was not even close to a fair fight. 3 of his team were killed in the first 2 minutes, but Minho kept moving, kept shooting, kept pushing toward the school dome. He got there just as the Verath soldiers were breaking through the doors. What he saw inside stopped him cold. The Verath had set up machines. They were medical devices of some kind, cold and sharp and humming with energy. Children were being pulled from their hiding places and strapped to these machines. The devices were attached to their heads. Minho did not understand the science behind it, but he understood enough. The Verath had discovered that developing human brains produced a rare neurochemical compound. When extracted and refined, this compound could enhance the cognitive abilities of Verath officers. It made them smarter, faster, more alert, and the only way to get it was to take it from living human children. Minho fought his way inside. He killed 4 Vareth soldiers before a blast knocked him into a wall. His vision went white. When it came back, he was on the floor, and blood was running down his face. He found Jeho lying on the ground near one of the machines. The boy was unconscious. There were marks on his head where the extraction device had been attached. He was so small. He was so terribly small. Minho picked him up and held him, and looked around the room, and he saw Soi. She was hiding under a fallen table, pressed into the corner, silent as stone. She was holding one of Jeho's shoes. It must have come off when they took him. She was holding it so hard her fingers were white. Minho could not save everyone, he knew that, but he managed to get Soi and Jeho and a handful of other children into a basement storage room beneath the dome. He sealed the door. He set up what defenses he could, and then, with broken fingers and blood in his eyes, he pointed his emergency transmitter at the sky and sent a distress signal. The signal was messy. It was full of static and noise, and in the background you could hear the sounds of the attack. Children crying, explosions, the high, clicking language of the Vareth soldiers. Minho's voice was shaking, but clear. He said the name of the colony. He said they were under attack. He said they were taking the children. Then the signal cut out. That broken message traveled across space at the speed of light. It bounced off relay stations and signal boosters, jumping from one to the next, like a stone skipping across dark water. It passed through 3 star systems. It was picked up by a listening post, flagged as urgent, encrypted, and forwarded up the chain of command. Within 1 hour, it reached the United Earth Fleet flagship, Geomoon. Admiral Tejo was in his quarters when it arrived. He was a tall man, with gray at his temples, and a face that rarely showed what he was feeling. He had served in the fleet for 30 years. He had fought in border skirmishes and pirate wars and diplomatic standoffs. He sat at his desk and he pressed play on the recording. He listened to the whole thing. The static, the screaming, the voice of a young sergeant trying to hold himself together while the world came apart around him. When it was done, Tejo played it again. His face did not change. His breathing did not change. He set down the cup of tea he had been holding. He set it down very carefully, as if the cup was the most important thing in the world, as if by controlling this one small action, he could control everything inside him that was trying to break free. Then he stood up. He walked to the bridge. Every officer on deck looked up when he entered, because something in the way he moved made the air feel different, heavier. He stood in the center of the bridge, and he spoke 5 words. Wake up the entire fleet. The order went out, under a code that most officers had only ever seen in training simulations. Condition: Iron Cradle. It meant one thing, and every human in uniform knew what it meant. Children had been harmed. Across the galaxy, on warships and bases and stations and quiet posts on the edges of nowhere, the signal arrived. Lights came on in dark rooms. Engines that had been sleeping began to hum. Men and women who had been eating dinner or reading books or putting their own children to bed stopped what they were doing and stood up. Humanity was waking up, and it was not waking up gently. The Galactic Assembly was a massive hall carved into the heart of a hollow moon. It had seats for the representatives of over 300 species. The ceiling was painted with star maps, and the walls were lined with translation devices that could turn any language into any other language in real time. It was built to be a place of reason, a place where wars ended before they started. For 200 years, it had mostly worked. Hana walked to the center of the speaking floor in a simple dark suit. She was the chief diplomat of the Galactic Relations Bureau, and she had spent her career smiling at aliens, learning their customs, tasting their food, laughing at their jokes. She was good at her job because she truly liked people, all kinds of people, even the ones who were not technically people at all. She had friends in half the delegations in this room. Today, she did not smile. She activated the display behind her and began to speak. Her voice was even and clear and completely calm. She showed them footage from Minho's helmet camera. The assembly saw the Verath ships descending on a colony that had no weapons. They saw soldiers breaking into a school full of children. They saw the extraction machines. They saw a 5-year-old boy with tubes attached to his skull, lying on a metal table, not moving. The hall was silent. Some delegates looked away. A representative from the Nalori species, a race of tall, thin beings known for their emotional sensitivity, actually stood up and walked out of the room. Others sat very still, as if moving might make what they were seeing more real. Hana let the footage play for exactly 90 seconds. Then she stopped it. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She presented medical reports. She presented the chemical analysis of the extraction compound. She presented evidence that the attack was not the action of a rogue commander, but had been authorized at the highest levels of the Verath Dominion. Every piece of evidence was clean, clear, and impossible to argue with. When she was finished with the evidence, she folded her hands and looked around the room. Several delegates opened their mouths to speak. Offers of mediation, calls for an emergency session, suggestions for economic sanctions, the usual tools, the usual slow, careful political process. Hana spoke before any of them could. "This is a formal notification," she said, "not a request." She informed the assembly that Earth was invoking Article Omega. A murmur spread through the hall like wind through dry leaves. Article Omega was a clause that humanity had insisted on including when they first joined the Galactic Assembly 80 years ago. Every other species had thought it was dramatic, a piece of human sentimentality that would never matter. The clause stated in simple language that any act of deliberate and targeted harm against human children by a sovereign species would be treated as an existential act of war against all of humanity, with no limitations on the response. No limitations. The Pelori ambassador, a large being with 4 arms and a deep voice, rose and asked Hana to reconsider. He said that the assembly had mechanisms for justice. He said that war would only bring more suffering. He said that humanity was better than this. Hana looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "We tried being better than this for 300 years. We smiled. We signed treaties. We shared our food and our music and our medicine with every species that asked. And while we were doing that, someone walked into a school and cut open our children to drain their brains for profit." She paused. "We are done smiling." She left the speaking floor. Behind her, the assembly erupted into noise, but it did not matter. The decision was already made. It had been made the moment the first extraction device touched the first child's head. 600 light-years away, aboard the Geomon, Admiral Tejo stood in the Fleet Command Center and looked at a map of Verath space. The map was detailed, extremely detailed. Every planet, every moon, every station, every shipyard, every supply route, every military base. All of it marked, measured, and catalogued. Nari, the fleet's intelligence officer, stood beside him. She was a quiet woman, with short black hair, and eyes that noticed everything. Tejo looked at the map, and then looked at her. "How long have we been mapping the Verath?" he asked. Nari did not hesitate. "Since the day we first made contact with them, Admiral. 26 years. Why? Because they reminded us of someone we used to be, and we know what that kind of species is capable of." Tejo nodded. It was the most natural thing in the world. Humanity had walked among the stars with open hands and warm hearts. But behind the smiles, behind the art and the music and the laughter, there had always been a quiet machine running in the background, watching, measuring, preparing. Because humans knew, better than any species in the galaxy, what cruelty looked like. They had invented most of it themselves before they learned to be better. and they had never forgotten the lessons. Darwin arrived on the Geoman by shuttle that evening. He was the Special Operations Commander, a broad man with a scarred jaw, and hands that looked like they had been carved from wood. He had spent 15 years on the ground in the worst places the galaxy had to offer. He did not waste words. Tejo briefed him personally. The mission was simple. Go to Biol 3, get the children out. Then hold the colony until the main fleet arrived. Darwin asked one question. Rules of engagement? Tejo looked at him. Bring the children home. I do not care what is in your way. Darwin saluted and left. Within the hour his team was assembled and boarding their dropships. Every single one of them had volunteered. Every single one of them had listened to the distress recording from Minho. None of them needed a speech. None of them needed to be told why they were going. On the other side of the galaxy, in the throne world of the Verath Dominion, High Commander Torek was receiving praise. He stood before the Verath High Council in a chamber made of dark stone, and reported that the collection operation on Biol 3 had been a complete success. The compound extracted from the human children was of exceptional quality. The council was pleased. Torek was promoted. The Verath did not think of humans as threats. They thought of humans the way a hunter thinks of fruit-eating animals. Soft, slow, emotional. Humans cried when their children were born. They cried when their parents died. They cried at songs and stories and sunsets. What kind of species cries at a sunset? The Verath had conquered dozens of worlds and bullied dozens of species. None of them had ever done anything about it. Why would the humans be different? In the back of the chamber, a sub-commander named Ilsha listened to Torek's report and said nothing for a long time. She was younger than most of the officers present, and she had spent more time studying other species than fighting them. When the celebration died down, she approached Torek privately. I have a concern, she said. Torek clicked his mandibles in amusement. What concern could there be? The humans have no significant fleet presence in this sector. Ilsha chose her words carefully. I have studied the humans. They are strange. They cry, yes. They cry at everything. But I have noticed something about what they do after they cry. They dry their eyes. They stand up. They build things. Monuments. Memorials. They write the names of their dead on walls, and they visit those walls for 100 years. They do not forget. They are not capable of forgetting. Torek stared at her. And we just gave them something to remember. Torek dismissed her with a wave of his claw. Ilsha returned to her quarters and looked at a display screen that showed the edge of Verath space. It was dark, empty, quiet. It would not be quiet for long. The United Earth Fleet completed its assembly in 36 hours. 4,200 warships, carriers, battleships, destroyers, frigates, support vessels, hospital ships. They gathered at the edge of Verath space in perfect formation, like a wall made of metal and light. They were close enough to be seen on Verath long-range sensors, close enough to be counted. And then they stopped. They did not fire. They did not send a message. They did not issue a warning or a demand or a threat. They just sat there, engines humming, weapons armed, 4,000 ships in the dark, and they waited. For one full standard day, they did absolutely nothing. Inside the Verath Military Command, officers stared at their sensor screens and tried to understand what was happening. Was it a bluff? A show of force? A negotiating tactic? They sent messages. They received no reply. They sent probes. The probes were allowed to approach, scan the fleet, and return. The humans did not interfere. They wanted the Verath to see. They wanted them to count every ship. They wanted them to understand, slowly and completely, what was sitting on their doorstep. The silence was not an absence of communication. It was the communication. It said, "We are here, and we want you to spend the next 24 hours thinking about what you did and what is about to happen to you because of it." By the end of that day, Ilsha noticed that 3 Varath border garrisons had stopped responding to commands. Their officers had looked at the sensor data, looked at the size of the human fleet, and quietly decided that they did not want to be the first thing standing in its path. The silence was worse than any declaration of war. Dowan's dropships came in low and fast, skimming the surface of Bjol 3 so close that the grass bent flat beneath them. They did not come from orbit. They came from behind the planet's second moon, where they had been waiting in silence for 6 hours, engines cold, running on battery power, invisible to Vareth sensors. By the time the Vareth garrison detected the approaching ships, Dowan's boots were already on the ground. His team moved through the burning colony like water flowing through cracks. 42 soldiers. Every one of them had been selected by Dowan personally, and every one of them had the same look in their eyes, a kind of terrible calmness that had nothing to do with peace. They did not shout. They did not give speeches. They cleared buildings one at a time, room by room, corner by corner, with the quiet efficiency of people who had trained their entire lives for exactly this kind of moment. The Vareth garrison had 200 soldiers. They were well armed and well trained, and they were used to fighting species that ran away. Humans did not run away. When the first Varath squad encountered Dowan's team in the corridor near the medical center, they expected the humans to take cover and negotiate. Instead, the humans came straight at them, moving fast and low, firing with a precision that left no room for error. The Varath squad was down in 8 seconds. Minho heard the gunfire from the basement, where he had been hiding with the children for almost 3 days. He had run out of food the day before. He had been giving the children his water. He was bleeding from wounds he had not had time to treat, and his left arm was broken and held against his chest with a strip torn from his own shirt. But when he heard the sound of human weapons, a sound he had never been so grateful to hear in his life, he stood up and banged on the sealed door. Dowan's team found him 11 minutes later. Minho was standing in the doorway of the basement, with his one good arm holding a pistol that had exactly 2 shots left in it. Behind him, 14 children were huddled together in the dark. Some of them were crying. Some of them had stopped crying days ago and were just sitting in silence, staring at nothing. Dowan looked at Minho. He looked at the children. He put his hand on the young sergeant's shoulder and said, "You did good. We have it from here." Minho nodded. Then his legs gave out and he sat down on the floor and he cried. Not because he was sad. Because it was over. Because he had held on long enough and someone had finally come. The hardest part was the medical facility on the east side of the colony. This was where the Varoth had set up their extraction operation. Dowan split his team and led the assault on the facility himself. The Varath soldiers guarding it fought hard because they knew what was inside, and they knew what humans would do when they saw it. The battle lasted 22 minutes. When it was over, every Varath soldier in the facility was either dead or had surrendered. Dowan walked through the main door and stopped. The room was large and cold, and lit with blue-white lights that made everything look like it was made of ice. There were rows of metal tables, 30 of them, and on each table was a child. They were sedated, lying still, tubes and wires connected to devices that hummed against their small skulls. Monitors showed brain activity, heart rate, extraction progress. Everything was labeled and organized with the kind of clinical neatness that made it worse, because it meant this was not madness, it was not chaos. It was a system. Someone had designed these machines. Someone had calculated the optimal extraction rate from a 5-year-old human brain, the way you would calculate the yield of a harvest. Hyuk, the war correspondent embedded with Dawan's team, recorded everything. Its hands were steady, because that was his job. But later, when he filed his report, he would write that walking into that room was the worst moment of his life. And he had covered 3 wars before this one. Dawan walked along the rows. He checked each child. He called for medics. He gave orders in a voice that was level and clear and did not shake. Then he walked outside, around the corner of the building where nobody could see him, and he put his hands on his knees and breathed. Just breathed. For 30 seconds he was not a commander. He was just a man trying to hold himself together, because falling apart was not something he was allowed to do right now. Then he straightened up, wiped his face, and went back inside. Soy was found in a storage closet near the back of the facility. She had escaped from the extraction room somehow, maybe when the Varath were distracted by the attack, and she had crawled into the smallest space she could find. When the medic opened the door, Soy did not scream. She did not cry. She just looked up with enormous dark eyes and said, "My brother is still in there." Jeho was on one of the tables. He was alive. The extraction device had been attached, but had not completed its cycle. The medic who removed it said afterward that another hour would have caused permanent brain damage. Another 3 hours would have killed him. Jeho was unconscious, but his heart was beating, and he was breathing, and for now, right now, that was enough. On a rescue ship waiting in orbit, Yuna had been sitting in a metal chair for 19 hours. She had not eaten. She had not slept. She had bitten her own lips so hard it was bleeding, and she did not know it. When the communication officer on the ship turned to her and said, "Ma'am, they have your children. They are alive," Yuna made a sound that was not a word. It came from somewhere deeper than words. She put her face in her hands, and the ship's crew looked away to give her a moment that belonged only to her. With the children secured and the colony liberated, Admiral Tejo gave the order. One word, transmitted to every ship in the fleet simultaneously. Begin. The United Earth Fleet did not attack the Varith Dominion the way most species fought wars. They did not push forward slowly, taking territory system by system. They struck everywhere at once. In the first hour, coordinated attacks hit 14 Varith shipyards across 9 star systems. The shipyards were the Varath's ability to build new warships, and within 60 minutes, that ability no longer existed. Then came the Fold Space Jammers. Humanity had developed these devices in secret over the past 2 decades. They generated a field that disrupted fold space travel within an entire star system, which meant that any Varath ships inside the field could not jump to another system. They were trapped, isolated, cut off from communication and reinforcement. One by one, Varath's star systems went dark, each one sealed inside its own bubble of silence. The Varath High Command realized what was happening and scrambled a counterfleet. 6,000 warships, the largest force the Varath had ever assembled, surged toward the human fleet at the Ash Corridor, a narrow passage between 2 nebulae that was the main route into Varath core space. Torek himself commanded the fleet from the rear. He was confident. 6,000 ships against 4,000. The math was simple. The math was wrong. Tejo had studied the Varath for years. He knew they thought in 2 dimensions, spreading their forces wide, like insects swarming across a flat surface. They did not think up and down. So when the Varath fleet entered the Ash Corridor and spread into their standard wide formation, Tejo split his fleet into 3 groups. One hit them from the front, one dropped down from above the nebula, one rose from below, a 3-dimensional box that closed on the Varath fleet from directions they did not have the tactical tradition to defend against. The Battle of the Ash Corridor lasted 6 hours. When it was over, 70% of the Varath fleet was destroyed or disabled. Human losses were 11%. It was not a battle. It was a lesson. Across the galaxy, species that had known humans as friendly traders and cheerful diplomats and enthusiastic lovers of food and music watched the battle reports come in and said nothing for a long time. One alien ambassador, a representative of the small and peaceful Dorothy species, was asked by a journalist what he thought of the human response. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that would be quoted for the next 100 years. "We thought humans kept their children close because they were weak. We thought it was a sign of a soft species, always holding, always touching, always watching over their young. Now we understand. They kept their children close because they knew. They knew what they would become if anyone took them away." On the other side of the battlefield, Ilsha sat in the command center of her surviving ship and stared at the damage reports. Around her, Verath officers were shouting, arguing, blaming each other. Ilsha was silent. She pulled up a communication channel and recorded a message addressed to the human fleet. She offered to surrender her ships. She offered to hand over Torek personally. She asked only that the humans show mercy to the Verath civilians who had nothing to do with Biol 3. The reply came from Admiral Tejo. It was 4 words long. "Torek is not enough." Ilsha closed the channel and sat in the dark and tried to imagine what would be enough. In the weeks that followed the Battle of the Ash Corridor, the United Earth Fleet moved through Verath space like a surgeon cutting away disease. They did not burn worlds. They did not bomb cities. They did not target civilians or food supplies or hospitals. What they targeted was very specific. Military installations, weapons factories, warship docks, research facilities, ammunition stores, command centers. Every single piece of the machinery that allowed the Verath Dominion to make war was identified, located, and destroyed with a precision that terrified the rest of the galaxy more than any act of brute force ever could. Because brute force was anger. This was not anger. This was something colder and more permanent. This was a species calmly and systematically removing another species' ability to ever hurt anyone again, the way you would remove the teeth from a predator that had bitten a child. Admiral Tejo commanded the campaign from the bridge of the Geomon. He slept 4 hours a night and spent the rest of his time studying reports, adjusting strategies, and making decisions that would shape the future of an entire region of space. He did not raise his voice. He did not give passionate speeches. He gave orders in a quiet, steady tone that somehow made everyone around him work harder than any amount of shouting ever could. His officers would later say that the most frightening thing about serving under Tejo during the war was not the battles. It was the way he drank his tea while reading casualty reports, as if he had built a wall inside himself to keep the grief in one room and the work in another. And the wall was made of something that would not break. Dawan led the ground campaigns. After liberating Biol 3, his forces hit 3 more Verath worlds where captives were being held, not just human captives. On the second world they liberated, they found holding cells containing members of 6 different alien species, beings who had been taken by the Verath over a period of decades for various forms of exploitation. Some of them had been there so long they did not remember their own names. Dawan soldiers freed them, treated their wounds, documented everything, and moved on. They also treated wounded Verath. This confused the Verath more than anything else. After a battle on the industrial moon of Verath 7, a group of injured Verath soldiers were found in the ruins of a collapsed barracks. They expected to be killed. Instead, human medics arrived, set up a field hospital, and began treating their wounds alongside the wounds of human soldiers. One Verath officer asked a human medic why they were helping the enemy. The medic, a young woman named Unji, looked at him and said, "Because you are hurt, and I am a doctor. It is not more complicated than that." The Verath officer did not speak again for a long time. This was the thing that the galaxy could not understand about humans. They could destroy a fleet of 6,000 warships in an afternoon, and then spend the evening bandaging the survivors. They could fight with a ferocity that made ancient warrior species look timid, and then cry over a letter from home. They contained everything at once, compassion and fury, mercy and steel, and neither one canceled out the other. Hyuk, the war correspondent, filed reports from the front lines that were read by billions of beings across the galaxy. He wrote about what he saw with simple honesty. He described the extraction facility on Biel 3 without exaggeration, because the truth did not need to be exaggerated. He described the liberation of the captives. He described Dawan soldiers sharing their food with Verath refugees, who had been displaced by the collapse of their military infrastructure. His reports became the most widely read journalism in galactic history, and they changed the way every species in the galaxy thought about humans forever. 3 weeks into the war, Hana returned to the Galactic Assembly. She stood on the same speaking floor where she had delivered her notification, and she presented humanity's terms. She did not present them as demands. She presented them as facts, as things that were going to happen whether the Verath agreed or not, and the only question was whether they would happen with Verath cooperation or without it. The terms were these. First, the complete and permanent disarmament of the Verath Dominion. Every warship, every weapon, every military facility would be dismantled. The Verath would be allowed to keep a small defense force, sufficient to protect their civilian population from pirates and natural disasters, but nothing more. Second, every individual involved in the planning, authorization, and execution of the Bial 3 attack would be surrendered to a joint tribunal for trial. Third, the Verath would fund the medical rehabilitation and lifetime care of every child who had been harmed. Not just the human children, all of them, every species. Fourth, the Verath government would issue a public acknowledgement of what they had done, broadcast in every language to every species in the Galactic Assembly. No excuses, no justifications, just the truth. And fifth, if any Verath individual or faction ever harmed a human child again, there would be no terms. There would be no tribunal. There would be no second chance. There would be nothing left to offer terms to. Several delegates noted that the terms were, by the standards of galactic warfare, remarkably restrained. Humanity was not asking for territory. They were not asking for tribute, or slaves, or resources. They were not asking for the destruction of the Verath species. They were asking for safety, permanent, guaranteed, unbreakable safety for their children. And they were making it very clear that the price of violating that safety would be everything. The Pelori ambassador, who had urged Hana to reconsider weeks ago, stood and formally endorsed the terms. One by one, the other delegations followed. Inside the Verath Dominion, the war had broken more than military infrastructure. It had broken the social order. The Verath were a caste society. The military caste, led by Torek and commanders like him, had ruled for generations. They had told the worker caste and the civilian caste that military strength was the only thing that mattered, that the Dominion's power came from its ability to take what it wanted. And now that military strength was gone, shattered by a species that the military caste had called soft and weak. The lie was exposed, and lies that big do not die quietly. Worker caste Thereth began refusing orders. Civilian administrators began demanding that Torek and his loyalists answer for the disaster they had brought upon their people. On 3 Verith worlds, military officers were overthrown by their own populations. The Dominion was not falling to human weapons. It was falling to the truth. Ilsha moved quickly. She gathered the officers and administrators who wanted to end the war, and she led a direct confrontation with Torek's remaining loyalists on the throne world. Torek's forces were outnumbered and demoralized, and many of them simply put down their weapons when they saw which way things were going. Torek himself was captured in his command chamber, still shouting orders to soldiers who were no longer listening. Ilsha contacted Admiral Tejo on a direct channel. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had aged 10 years in 3 weeks. She asked him one question. "Do you truly intend to destroy us entirely?" Tejo was quiet for a long time, long enough that Ilsha began to wonder if the connection had been lost. Then he spoke. "We are not like you," he said. "We do not want to destroy your species. We want to make sure that no Vareth, not now, not in 1,000 years, ever looks at a human child and sees anything other than a line that must never be crossed. If you can guarantee that, then your species will survive. And if you cannot guarantee it, then we will keep going until there is no one left who needs to." Ilsha agreed to the terms, all of them, without modification. The tribunal was held on a neutral station in assembly space. Torek was brought before it in restraints. He was tall, taller than any human in the room, and his black eyes were still full of pride. He stood at the center of the chamber and looked around at the judges, the diplomats, the officers, the journalists, as if they were all beneath him. Then the door opened, and Yuna walked in, holding Soi's hand. Soi was 8 years old. She had dark hair and dark eyes, and she was wearing a blue dress that Yuna had bought for her the day before. She looked very small in that large room, full of powerful beings. She walked beside her mother, with her back straight and her chin up, and she stopped 10 feet from the creature who had ordered soldiers to break into her school and strap her brother to a machine. She looked at him. Torek, High Commander of the Vareth Dominion, conqueror of worlds, veteran of 100 campaigns, looked back at this human child. And for the first time in his life, for reasons he would never fully understand, he could not hold the gaze. His eyes moved to the floor. His mandibles went still. Something in the way this small being looked at him, without hatred, without fear, with just a calm, steady knowing, made him feel a thing that the Vareth did not have a word for. The humans had a word for it. They called it shame. Soi did not say anything. She did not need to. She looked at Torek for 10 seconds, and then she turned and walked back to her mother. As she walked, she reached up and took Yuna's hand again, and Yuna held it tight, and they left the chamber together. Behind them, Torek stood alone under the lights, and for the first time, the room felt like it was the right size, and he was too small for it. 5 years passed. Worlds turned. Stars burned. The galaxy moved on the way galaxies always do, slowly and all at once, and the war between humanity and the Vareth became history. But it was the kind of history that doesn't fade. It was the kind that gets carved into walls and taught in schools and whispered between species who meet each other for the first time and need to know one important thing. Do not touch the humans' children. Do not even think about it. The Vareth Dominion no longer existed. In its place was the Vareth Republic, a restructured civilian government led by Ilsha, who had gone from sub-commander to head of state in the space of a single terrible month. The transition was not easy. Nothing about rebuilding a society ever is. But the humans, to the shock of many in the galaxy, helped. They sent engineers to repair civilian infrastructure that had been damaged in the war. They sent doctors to Vareth worlds, where hospitals were understaffed. They sent teachers and agricultural experts and water treatment specialists. They did not do this because they had forgiven the Vareth. They did it because they understood something that most species did not. Destroying a species' ability to make war was only half the job. The other half was giving them something to build instead. Ilsha accepted the help because she had no choice, and because she was smart enough to see what the humans were doing. They were not being generous, they were being strategic. A Verath republic that was stable and prosperous and connected to the rest of the galaxy through trade and cooperation would never have a reason to return to its old ways. A Verath republic that was poor and angry and humiliated would be a time bomb. The humans were not just winning the war, they were winning the peace. And they were doing it with the same quiet, relentless thoroughness with which they had done everything else. It took 2 years, and when it was finished, the colony was larger and more beautiful than it had been before. New domes rose from the hillside, bigger and brighter, with gardens that spilled over with green and gold. A new school was built in the center of the colony, with wide windows that let in the morning sun and walls that were painted with murals by the children who attended it. The murals showed stars and trees and families and ships and 100 other things that mattered to the people who lived there. At the heart of the colony, in a small garden surrounded by flowering trees, was a memorial. It was a simple thing, a wall of smooth, dark stone with names engraved on it. The names of every child who had been taken during the attack. Next to some of the names were small stars. These were the children who did not survive. There were 9 of them. 9 small stars for 9 small lives that ended in a cold room on a metal table because someone decided that their brains were worth more than their futures. People came to the memorial at all hours. They brought flowers, they brought drawings, they brought small toys and stones, and folded pieces of paper with messages written inside. The wall was never bare. It was always covered with signs of remembrance, because that is what humans do. They remember. It is the thing they are best at, and the thing that makes them most dangerous, because a species that remembers everything will never let the same thing happen twice. Jeho was 10 years old now. He had recovered from his physical injuries, though a thin scar ran along his left temple where the extraction device had been attached. He was a quiet boy. He had always been quiet, even before the attack, but now his quietness had a different quality to it. It was deeper. He spent a lot of time drawing, the way he had when he was small, but his drawings were different now. He used to draw trees with stars growing on them. Now, he drew ships, patrol ships, guardian ships, ships that flew in wide circles around small worlds, keeping watch. Soi was 13. She had grown tall and sharp and fierce, in the way that young girls become fierce when they have seen something that no child should see. She was protective of her brother, in a way that went beyond normal sibling love. She walked him to school every morning, just as she had before. But now she walked with her eyes scanning the sky, checking, always checking, even though she knew the patrol ships were up there. Even though she knew it was safe. She had told her mother that she wanted to join the United Earth Fleet when she was old enough. Yuna had asked her why. Soi had thought about it for a moment and said, "Not to fight. I do not want to fight, but I want to be up there. I want to be one of the ships that flies in circles around places like this, so that when some little kid looks up at the sky, they see us, and they know that nobody is coming to hurt them. I want to be the reason they are not scared." Yuna had not known what to say to that, so she had just held her daughter and said nothing, and let the silence be enough. Minho stayed on Biol 3. He was offered a promotion, a transfer, a medal, a dozen different things that would have taken him away from the colony. He turned them all down. He became the head of the colony's security force, which was now properly funded and properly equipped. And he trained every member of his team with the same stubbornness that had kept him alive in that basement for 3 days. He still had a limp from the injuries he had received during the attack. He could have had it fixed with modern medicine, but he chose not to. When people asked him why, he said it helped him remember. He did not explain what it helped him remember. He did not need to. Admiral Tejo retired. He did it quietly, without ceremony, the way he did everything. His officers threw him a small gathering on the Guillauman. Dowan was there, and Nari, and a few dozen others who had served with him during the war. The food was simple. The conversation was warm. Near the end of the evening, Dowen, who had never been good at leaving things unsaid, asked Teho what he had felt when he first heard the distress call from Biel 3. Teho thought about it for a while, holding his tea the way he always held it, with both hands, as if it might float away. "I felt the same thing every human feels," he said. "The same thing we have felt since we lived in caves and heard our young cry out in the dark. I felt the need to go toward the sound." He took a sip. "The only difference is, this time, I had 4,000 warships." It was a tired laugh, the kind shared by people who have been through something that cannot be fully explained to anyone who was not there. But it was real, and it was warm, and it was enough. On the Verath throne world, in a study that used to belong to a military commander, and now belonged to a civilian leader, Ilsha wrote. She had been writing for months, a long and careful study for the Galactic Archive. She called it The Human Contradiction. In it, she examined the species that had dismantled her people's military in less than a month with the cold efficiency of a machine, and then sent teachers and doctors to help rebuild what was left. She studied their history, their art, their wars, their music, their laws, their contradictions. She read their poetry and their battle plans. She listened to their lullabies and their war drums. Her conclusion was this: humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the fastest or the most technologically advanced. They were not the most logical or the most ancient. But they were, without any doubt, the most dangerous. Not because of their weapons, not because of their tactics, but because their capacity for love and their capacity for wrath came from the exact same place inside them, and that place had no bottom. You could not reach the end of how much a human could love their child, and therefore you could not reach the end of what they would do to anyone who hurt that child. The two things were the same thing. That was the contradiction. That was what made them terrifying. She wrote her final line: "If you must interact with humans, I offer this advice. Be their friend. Eat their food. Listen to their music. Let them show you pictures of their children. Laugh at their jokes. Trade with them. Build with them. But if you are ever tempted, even for a moment, even for the smallest and most practical of reasons, to harm one of their young, then I suggest you look up at the sky and remember what is out there, circling in the dark, waiting, remembering." She put down her pen and looked out the window at the night sky and wondered if, somewhere out there, a human patrol ship was watching her world right now. She decided it probably was. She found, to her surprise, that she did not mind. On Biol 3, night had fallen. The sky was full of stars, thick and bright and impossibly beautiful, the way skies are on worlds that are far from the noise and light of big cities. Yuna tucked Jeho into bed and pulled the blanket up to his chin. He was getting too big for tucking in, but he had not asked her to stop, and she had not offered. Some things you hold on to. Some things you do not let go of, no matter how big your children get. Zoe was already in bed, half asleep, her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. She had school in the morning and a test she had been studying for, and her eyes were heavy. Jeho looked up at his mother. "Mom," he said, "are the stars safe?" Yuna looked at him. She looked at his scar. She looked at his eyes, which were the same eyes he had had when he was 5 years old and carried a drawing of a tree with stars growing on it. The same eyes that had been closed and still on a metal table while machines hummed against his skull. She looked at her son, and she felt the thing that every human parent feels, the love that is so big it hurts, the love that built the ships and trained the soldiers and tore apart an empire and then helped put it back together again. She leaned down and kissed his forehead. "The stars have always been safe, baby. That is what your people are for." From the other bed, Soyi murmured, half in sleep, half in the warm space between waking and dreaming. Biol means star, Mom. Yuna smiled. She pushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face. Yes, it does. She turned off the light and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her children in the dark. Outside, above the colony, above the hills and the domes and the memorial garden, the stars burned on, steady and bright and ancient. And somewhere among them, moving in slow, patient circles, human ships kept watch, silent, faithful, unending. The lights went out. The stars stayed on.